Day and welcome to part 5 of this series of discussions on government, brought to you by a politically incorrect old white guy. In today's section, we're going to examine the structure of government in the Republic of South Africa, a country I'm very familiar with, having spent many years of my life there. I served there in the military, and I was, in fact, an officer in the South African Corps of Engineers. Those are combat engineers that are responsible for, among other things, mine warfare and demolitions. I warned you I was politically incorrect, and what could be more politically incorrect than that? Before we get on with that subject, let's review what we've covered already. I made several assertions, the first being that government will fail you, and I'm going to cite 3 new examples today. First, the Social Security Administration has apparently made errors to the tune of something like $1 billion recently in Social Security payments that were either incorrect or went to the wrong people, went to dead people, that sort of thing. That's typical government efficiency for you. Second, the Department of Homeland Security, I believe it was, has lost track of 2 million unaccompanied minors that are illegally in the United States and are supposed to be placed with in foster homes or with relatives or friends or what have you. And this is not a desirable situation because these people often end up on the wrong end of these kids end up on the wrong end of shall we say human trafficking practices. And third, there was recently a shooting where a young man, unfortunately, was given a AR-style rifle by his father for a birthday gift. The young man was not mentally stable. Everybody knew that. Even the FBI knew that. They had been to the home and interviewed the parents some time ago, but apparently did nothing about further about the matter. Left the kid in the home with guns in the house. Despite numerous warnings, the FBI dropped the ball, and as a result, some people were unfortunately killed and wounded. So there you have it, just some more examples of how government fails us every day. My second assertion was that government is a leaky bucket, and by that I mean they waste money, and I don't think that's controversial at all. There are many examples, and I don't need to go into them. Third, having said those 2 things, government is nonetheless or nevertheless necessary in a modern society, and then that leads one to resolve that dilemma by designing a government that works but does so as effectively and efficiently as possible, recognizing that that's going to be hard to do. My hypothesis or assertion is that the only way to do that is to keep government as close as possible to the people, to the voters, to the taxpayers, to limit the role of government to those roles that are absolutely necessary and cannot be provided by the private sector for whatever reason. The most common being the service is something everybody wants, but nobody's willing to pay for. And there you have national defense, as an example. the other examples being natural monopolies where the private sector cannot be quote unquote trusted to provide the service without overcharging for the service. In that case, you could argue that government ought to provide the service, but yeah, I think that's a weak argument because government overcharges you in the form of unnecessarily high taxation because they're so wasteful. I think a preferable solution is for the private sector to provide the service with some measure of regulation by the government to ensure that their private sector is not abusing their monopoly power in that case. And they're in a large developed economy like the United States, there are very few natural monopolies left. The US Postal Service used to be thought of as a monopoly, but really, if you look at it, there is competition for the US Postal Service in the form of FedEx, UPS, DHL, and of course, substitutes such as email and texting and what have you. So even there's a very weak argument that there are natural monopolies. In smaller countries with less developed economies, those countries often have a national airline because the country's not big enough to support two airlines, and national railroad and national power company and so on. And we're going to talk about, as an example of failure and unnecessarily complexity, we're going to talk about South Africa today as a case study of that scenario. So, according to the Economist, which is one of the most respected publications in the world, comes out of the UK. And they keep track of what's going on around the world. Here they state that the failing ANC is rejected by over half of South Africa. This references the recent election in which the ANC, which up to now has proven to be more or less dominant in the political arena, commanding strong majority of the vote nationally, has now lost popularity and has achieved less than 50% of the vote, which in their system means that they need to now form some sort of coalition government with other parties, much as the British system works. And the reasons that the ANC is the African National Congress, which is the party of the well-known Nelson Mandela. The reason they're now being rejected by voters after 30 years of dominance is that they have basically destroyed the economy. They're, the boogeyman of apartheid is a fading memory, and that doesn't buy them any votes anymore. And people rather are concerned about such things as the power grid. South Africa is one of those countries where the country is not really big enough to have competing utilities. So there's a single large power company, generation company called Eskom, which stands for Electricity Supply Commission, which is a government entity. And that since the ANC government took over, has basically collapsed for various reasons. But the net result is that almost every consumer of electricity, be it in industrial, commercial, or residential in that country, faces repeated load shedding events, which means the power goes off for periods during the day and the night, repeatedly, making life very difficult. The railroad, which again was a national entity, a government entity, South African Railroad Company, I think it's called, has all but ceased to operate due to incompetence and theft of copper lines. The railroad is the locomotives are electric. Again, that country for many years had very cheap electricity and plenty of it. Doesn't have it that anymore, as I've just mentioned. But the rail, um, the trains need power to run, and they get their power from overhead conductors made out of copper, and these have been stolen for scrap, and even in many cases, the steel railroad tracks have been stolen um, and lifted and stolen for scrap metal. So the railroad that doesn't function, or if it does function in a very limited, to a very limited degree, which uh, obviously handicaps industry in that country. The South African Airways, which again was a national company, a government-run company, and for many years was highly regarded, certainly the best in Africa and one of the best in the world, has gone bankrupt, again due to incompetence and corruption by the political appointees of the ANC. They have this concept of cadre deployment, which they learned from the Russian Marxists. And what that means is you appoint loyal party members to all significant positions in the government, including these parastatal entities, businesses, whether they're qualified or know anything about that business or not. So you put someone in charge of the airline, not because they understand how to run an airline, but because they are loyal, card-carrying ANC members who will do the bidding of the government. One of the things the government was keen on was so-called black economic empowerment, which they've implemented throughout their government-owned entities, but also forced upon the private sector. And what that means is that the shareholders of any corporation over a certain rather modest size have to be at least 50% black. And how they get to own that 50% is not the concern of the government, except in many of the ANC leadership have figured out that they may as well be the chosen partners for their cousins or wives or other relatives, and they've all gotten very rich very fast by pushing themselves forward as the solution to the need of private sector to appoint black shareholders. And then they've made it very difficult to hire and promote anyone but a black person for any position of significance. And so I'm not saying that being black makes you incompetent, but the reality is that the depth of skill in that population sector is rather shallow, and many of these appointees have been incompetent or worse, corrupt. Most of the municipalities, which in this United States instance would be county officials, most of the municipal employees have basically stolen money from their coffers, and the municipalities, I think something like 75% of them are out of money, and the potholes in the streets are terrible, and sewage is flowing through some of the streets. So it's just a mess, and the people care about that stuff, and they the rah-rah about freedom only lasts so long. You can't eat a ballot, and as a result, the government is collapsing. Let's now have a look at this map. This is a map of South Africa, the white area, the southern tip of Africa. This is the old map of the country prior to the ANC rejiggering everything. And what you see is four provinces: the Cape Province, which used to be a British colony at the outset, and it's rather large. course, the Cape Town, the harbor is the center of commercial activity for the Cape Province. The province of Natal, which was also a British colony back in the day. Durban is another port there, and that was the British Navy showed up there and proclaimed the Natal. At some point, they proclaimed that a colony, much as in the United States, the country, had its origins in an amalgamation of many colonies. The Transvaal was the area of the country where most of the gold and other minerals are located, platinum group metals, etc. Headquartered, or the biggest commercial center is Johannesburg, which is where the gold mining activities began, because the gold reef, it's a sedimentary deposit, a gold reef outcropped. In other words, it was on the surface, right in the middle of what's now Johannesburg, and that's where the mining started. Pretoria is the seat of government, or was the seat of government at the time. And the Transvaal was, when these two colonies were colonies of the British Empire, the Transvaal was a quote-unquote Boer republic, which meant that the Dutch that had left the Cape and headed inland, known as Boers, which is a Dutch word for farmer, B-O-E-R, not B-O-O-R, settled in this area, and they proclaimed this as a Boer republic, with Paul Kruger of Kruger Rand fame as their leader. And then the Orange Free State was the second Boer republic, which didn't have a lot going for it back in the day, other than diamonds, which is Kimberley is not shown on the map. This is where the great diamond discovery took place that led to the excavation of what became known as the Big Hole, where the kimberlite pipe was excavated from the surface down to a depth where water became a problem, and then subsequently from underground workings, huge amounts of diamonds were extracted from that deposit, and that was the origin of the fortune of some of the most famous companies and families in that part of the world. So you had these four entities, which after the Boer War and where the Boers and the British duked it out, 1899 to 1902. At the end of that, the British prevailed, and they forced these four entities to form the Union of South Africa, which was still administered by the British at that time, the British governor, but they had some degree of local freedom and independence. So that was how this map came to be. There are two little blobs here that are not part of South Africa. Lesotho is an independent country. It's called the Switzerland of Africa because of its location in some of the highest mountain regions of the country. Lesotho is still independent today, but has gone through some upheavals. It was run as a monarchy for a long time there with a king and what have you. And then Swaziland, likewise, is the kingdom of the Swazi nation, just as Natal was the kingdom of the Zulu nation. And it's an independent country bordering on Mozambique, which was a Portuguese colony for many years, and eventually threw off colonial rule and then went into civil war for decades. Zimbabwe was formerly Rhodesia, again threw off colonial power, was run by whites for many decades, and was quite prosperous. And then the winds of change blew through Zimbabwe and led to the ascension of Robert Mugabe, who destroyed the economy and is most famous for the most spectacular implosion of its currency, of any currency in the world. The Zimbabwe dollar was made worthless on more than one occasion by the policies of the Mugabe government. Botswana is another adjoining country, which was formerly the protectorate of Bechuanaland, which was under the British Empire, and then back in the 60s, I believe it was, became independent, and is actually a shining example of democracy and prosperity in Africa. It's the only country in Africa that doesn't have the typical third world collapse syndrome. Botswana is a very sparsely populated country. Um, it has vast diamond deposits, which were discovered by the same people that mined the Kimberley deposit, the same company, De Beers, developed the mines in Botswana, discovered them, developed them, and shares, of course, the revenue with the government of Botswana. So the government of Botswana has adequate funding and has been wise in their administration of the country. And it's actually a wonderful country. It's very arid for the most part, but has some exceptionally beautiful attractions such as the Okavango Delta, which draw a huge number of tourists from Europe mainly. Um, they have, basically done their own thing for a long time, and they continue to succeed. Their GDP per capita surpassed that of South Africa back in I want to say the 90s, and the country continues to prosper. Namibia used to be called Southwest Africa. It was a German colony at one time, was then taken from the Germans after World War II and given to South Africa as an area to administer. They didn't annex it, but they administered the country. And again, arid, sparsely populated, has minerals, again, diamonds off the coastline here. The Orange River, which is the border between South Africa and Namibia, dumps into the ocean here and has created vast alluvial deposits of diamonds in the dunes and in the shallow waters off the coast. And those have been mined again by De Beers, the Kimberley people, primarily, for many years, generating huge amounts of revenue for the government of Namibia and providing development and employment for the country. Aside from that, it's quite a bit of agricultural or it's ranching activity, tourism, and there are some other deposits of minerals in that country. It was liberated by a political party, and name I don't recall at the moment, and with very socialist or Marxist philosophy. In fact, if you go to the capital of Namibia, which is Windhoek, they haven't changed the name, the German name. You will find a Sam Nujoma Avenue. Nujoma was one of the Marxist founders of the ANC. You'll find a Robert Mugabe street or avenue. Robert Mugabe was the guy who destroyed Zimbabwe, also a rabid Marxist socialist, trained or educated, I believe, in Russia. And these people are of a like mind, and they've limited the development of the country to some extent because of it. The other thing that's notable about Namibia is off the coast here, there have now been a number of very promising oil discoveries on deep water. And it remains to be seen how that will pan out. It'll be some years before that comes on stream, but by all accounts, this country has a bright future handed to it because of its natural assets. Now, you may ask, what are all these colored splotches all over the map here? And this is where things get interesting. These are areas created by the former nationalist government of South Africa, the white run government, which represented mainly the Afrikaner or Boer segment of the white population. These are the homelands, and there are a number of them in different colors. What the homelands are pretty close to what we call reservations in the United States. They're areas set aside for indigenous peoples of various tribes. So here you have the Transkei, here you have the Ciskei, here you have KwaZulu Natal, which is for the Zulus. You have Bophuthatswana, you have Leboa, Venda, and so on. These are all different tribes that historically have been present in this part of the country, in these parts of the country, and the government created these entities to satisfy the political aspirations of these people, but at the same time retain control over the bulk of South Africa. And that policy never really, they were intended to become, have their own sovereignty with their own governments and what have you. Some of them did get to that point, not all of them. And that policy was overtaken by the transition to universal franchise elections that were held in the 90s that put the ANC into power, and they promptly scrapped this concept, and these homelands ceased to exist officially. In fact, unofficially, they still exist. These areas are now just called communal lands, and they're communally, there's no freehold or very little freehold land ownership. They're administered by traditional leaders, in other words, chiefs, who have authority over certain areas, and they decide, who gets to farm which piece of land and who gets to build their house where. For better or for worse, that's a traditional method or traditional form of governance among the Nguni peoples. And so that system still exists today, but you just don't see it on the map. Now, the reason I'm going into all this detail is South Africa is about not quite twice the size of Texas, and it was carved up into 4 states or provinces and administered that way. You could argue that Namibia was the 5th state, and it was effectively the 5th state for many decades. When the ANC got into power, they promptly got rid of that whole concept, and instead they divided the country up into 9 provinces. And here you see the new South Africa showing the 9 provinces. So now in an area not much bigger than Texas, you have 9 regions or 9 entities, which in my mind is too many. Some of these are very small and unnecessarily complex. The reason they did it was there were 9 prominent families that were active in the ANC at the time, and each one of them was rewarded with administration of their own province. So the Cape, which was one province, was divided into the Eastern Cape, which included the homelands of the Transkei and the Ciskei, the Western Cape, which is centered around Cape Town, the Northern Cape, and there you have now 3 provinces instead of 1. The Free State remained the Free State. The Boer Republic of the Transvaal was divided up into a number of chunks, I think 1, 2, 3, 4. Limpopo, Northwest, Mpumalanga, and Gauteng, and that's got to be the ugliest sounding name of any region of any country in the world, but there you have it. And that was basically just the area around, the most developed area around Johannesburg and Pretoria. And then Natal retained its original boundaries. Was renamed KwaZulu Natal because the Zulu nation back in the day historically resided in this area of the country, and was called, this northeastern corner was called Zulu land, and that's where the Zulus had their kingdom and their capital, and that's where the uh, war between the Zulus and the British Army took place back and forth over that border, as depicted in numerous movies, including the movie most people have seen, which is the movie of the clash at Rorke's Drift, and I think that movie was called Zulu Dawn. Um, so there you have the new South Africa. I will add that people draw parallels between, especially Americans, between the situation in South Africa and the situation in the United States. Uh, black versus uh, white supremacy, black subservience, et cetera. And I'd just like to point out that that's probably the wrong model to have in mind when you think about South Africa, for a couple of reasons. Number one is these black tribes that ended up being granted these homelands moved down. They're collectively called the Nguni people. They moved down from North Central Africa and migrated down to Southern Africa. At the time that the Dutch arrived in the Cape, there were no Nguni people in the Cape province to speak of. There was another indigenous group called the Bushmen, the Sand people, and then the Khoi, Hottentot Khoi people, who have been largely marginalized, and they're now present in Namibia and Botswana more than they are in South Africa. These Nguni people were not enslaved by the white settlers, the Dutch, and later the British. Um, there was some slavery in the Cape during the early days, but those slaves were imported from Madagascar and from the Asian continent. Um, they were not Nguni people that migrated down from the north. So the blacks in South Africa were never slaves. The blacks in South Africa are more akin to the indigenous Indians in the United States. So that's a paradigm shift that most people can't make. Um, the fact that there were two colonies and two republics that joined to form one country is somewhat parallel to what happened in the United States. There was a war of independence in the United States. There was the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa. The British won the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa, but that was the beginning of the end of the British Empire. The country eventually became a republic in the 60s after 60 years of British administration. And yeah, so that's a little history of South Africa, and I probably confused some people, but that's how we ended up with the South Africa that we recognize today. Now, South African government, despite there being 9 provinces, which are way too many in my opinion, is highly centralized. So these are the national government departments, much like the departments that, or the previous chart I showed of the agencies of the United States government, the federal government. And you can see them all here. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of them. The country is managed on a highly centralized model. Some of these things are obvious: defense. Well, here's one interesting one: police. Unlike the United States, the South African police force is centralized. There's only one South African. There's only one police force, and they police the entire country. So we don't have state troopers and local police like the United States. That doesn't exist in South Africa. Um, you can go to this site and see what each one of these entities does. Suffice it to say that they micromanage the country with a heavy dose of socialism, Marxism, and this has not been successful for them. They have found that their tax base is shrinking dramatically. Then there are increased taxes on those that have income multiple times, and it's never enough money. The typical situation. Many of these entities are holdovers from the prior government, which did much the same thing. They ran the country mostly centrally, but only with only 4 provinces. Like I said, you can go to the site and you can click on any one of these, and you can see what it is that they do. This is the Department of Land Reform and Rural Development, which falls under the Department of Agriculture, much similar to the Department of Agriculture that we have here in the United States. But you see them boasting about 30 years of democracy and partnership and growth. Well, South Africa has a very strong agricultural sector. They feed most of Southern Africa. It's a blessed country that's blessed with relatively good soil and favorable climate. So they produce vast amounts of corn and other crops. In the less areas that are more arid, they produce vast amounts of beef, sheep. In the more arid areas, the most arid areas, the Karoo, for example, that won't support cattle farming, that area is a major wool producer through the famous merino wool sheep breed. And you can see what these people do. One of the things that they now do that didn't exist prior is they are involved in land reform, and their goal is accelerating land reform here. And what that means is redressing the perceived injustice that most of the best agricultural land still belongs to white people, white farmers. And that is not, quote unquote, right. So the government has embarked on a whole series of initiatives aimed at redistributing the land. If that word sounds familiar, Barack Obama was big on redistribution of wealth. Redistribution of land is the same thing. And that effort has been bungled. Not much land has ended up in the hands of deserving Black people. There is still a lot of complaining and political grandstanding about the fact that the Blacks don't own enough land in South Africa. And those farms that have been sold to the government and then handed to new Black owners have failed miserably as commercial farms. There's very few examples of successes. There are some, obviously. The government is basically meddling in the free market, and they're doing what they always do when they meddle, and that is messing things up. In some cases, the group of persons that claimed the land rightfully belonged to them, and the land was eventually awarded to their ownership, awarded to them by a court action, were given the opportunity of money or land, and most of them took money. In the cases where they've taken the land doesn't belong to them. They don't have title to it. The land belongs to the government, and the government gives them the right to live on it and farm on it. much like the collective concept of the Russians, which doesn't ever work. Um, so this has been one of their big initiatives, and it has been a rather big failure. Um, Going back to the map, when you hear these pundits in the media say that repeat the claim that the whites own all the land, what they're not telling you is that all this land in that's colored here, the former homelands, do not belong to whites. As a white person, you cannot go and buy land in these communal areas. Um, and there is really very little or no freehold land in these areas. These areas now legally belong to the government, but they're excluded from this calculation that the whites still own 90% of the land, or whatever the recent statistic is that the liberals like to throw at you. Um, and then in addition, since the abolition of the Group Areas Act by the ANC, one of the first things they did, black people were allowed to purchase, in the free market, they were allowed to purchase property in these areas, and have done so, especially some of the more influential politicians. And then, of course, some of these farms in these areas were forcibly surrendered to claimants by the court system under the Land Reform Act, I think it was called. So there's a whole patchwork of black-owned land property farms in this former white area here, and none of it has really benefited anybody. Farming is a skill like anything else, and if you're not a skillful farmer, owning a piece of land doesn't make you a success. Especially if the piece of land is of marginal size, and the government is now, believe it or not, following a policy of one hectare, one farmer. Now a hectare is about 2.2 acres. So they think that the political answer here is to divide the country up into postage stamps of 2.2 acres in extent, and give that land to all of these so-called landless people, and that's somehow going to make the country a success. This is what brought Zimbabwe down. The major initiative of the Mugabe government, was to confiscate all of the white-owned commercial farms, and through a process that was corrupt and somewhat arbitrary, award those lands to various people, including influential government and military people that had no intention or desire to farm. And then, of course, some landless people that were politically favored were given land. And again, they were carved up into postage stamps. In the case of Zimbabwe, I believe the figure was 10 hectares. So you could build your house and you could farm 10 hectares. So a commercial farm that formerly, exported tobacco or corn or whatever, was now a subsistence farm populated by, carved up into hundreds of thousands of these little postage stamps, populated by people with no capital, no modern farming skills. And of course, the food production of Zimbabwe collapsed entirely, and people were dying of hunger, and the international aid agencies had to step in and in some cases smuggle food into Zimbabwe, because the Mugabe government didn't want to receive handouts. And a lot of the Zimbabwe population hopped across the border into South Africa, which at that time was still a fairly strong economy, so they were able to get jobs in South Africa. I recently stayed in a bed and breakfast in Cape Town. I was in South Africa for a wedding, and I overnighted in a bed and breakfast, and the owner of the bed and breakfast confided to me that all of her staff were Zimbabweans, because they were the locals had a generally bad attitude and didn't want to work, and the Zimbabweans were happy to have a job, and they were better educated and all around better employee than the locals. So that's what's going on in this country as well. They're following the Zimbabwe model, the collective farming model of the Soviet Union, and they're basically busy imploding. So that's a brief overview of the history of South Africa. And it just goes to show you that, governments do matter. Good governments, like Botswana, tend to endure, and everyone's happier and better off under those governments. Bad governments, like the government in South Africa, the ANC government, make everybody's life a misery, especially when they try to impose socialism and equity and these types of concepts on what was a first world country. I mean, it was a developed country in every respect. The first heart transplant ever was done in Cape Town by Dr. Christian Barnard in, I want to say, the 70s. 2/3, I believe, of the doctors in the entire Southern Hemisphere were practicing in South Africa at one time. So that gives you an idea of how advanced this country was. And now it's definitely, regressing, and it's, if not a third world country, on the verge of becoming a third world country again. So pay attention to what you want when you go to the ballot box, because you might get what you want and you might not realize, what that entails. So that's the session. That's the segment for today. In the next session, in the next series, I will get rid of this. In the next session, I will spend some time talking about Scandinavia, because the socialists, the people who aspire to a socialist form of government, which is another fancy word for free stuff, they continually point to Scandinavia as the model. They don't want to talk about Venezuela. They don't want to talk about South Africa. They don't want to talk about Zimbabwe. They don't want to talk about Cuba. But they love to talk about Scandinavia, which is a region of Europe which comprises Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, but not Finland. And how wonderful Scandinavia is, and how everything's free there, and everything is marvelous, and everybody's happy. I will spend some time on that notion, and hopefully bring some understanding to, what's behind that. I won't call it a myth, because they are successful countries, but that's not what you hear, is not the entire story. And then what we'll do after that is we'll come back to some prescriptions for reform in the United States. I've already said that I believe the country has too many states, that we need at most 10. I've already said that we've got too many counties, 4,000, I think the number is. We need maybe 1,000 at most in this day and age. And the question then becomes, who does what? If you recall the Australian model, they describe clearly what the central government does, what the states are responsible for, and what they call the councils, local councils, in our case counties, are responsible for as far as government services. So I have some ideas about that, which we will get into in the next session. And then I'll finish up with a discussion of how we maintain some semblance of unity as a country. Obviously, under this proposed model, there's a risk of fragmentation, such as occurred in some parts of Europe, where the successful states just decide to hell with it, we'll become our own country, and they probably could survive quite well like that. But there's some advantages to national unity, and I have some ideas as to how to, as to how to keep uh, the country together as where necessary or where it matters as a single country. The glue, if you like, that will keep those more powerful super states, I call them, all part of one country, the United States of America. Well, I thank you for your patience, and hopefully you found this educational, and we will continue. Have a government-free day.